right, so this morning, why don't we go ahead and grab our Bibles. We're going to go to Genesis chapter 32. And while you guys are heading there, for those of you who are new to our ministry or haven't been here the last couple weeks or missed a few things, I do want to give you a flyby of the story of Jacob, because I think Genesis is actually primarily about Jacob, if you think about it, in terms of just how much of the book is written about this one person. Basically, from the moment that he appears in Genesis 27 and on, you have this idea that the narrative is really about him, his transformation, his family. And I think it's important for us to recognize what's happened so far, because we miss so much. If I had an opportunity to go back, I would really want to just sit in Jacob for a while, because there's so much here for us to learn from and for us to learn from. For us to learn from and for us to know who God is through the way that he treats Jacob. So again, we start with Abraham. He's the main patriarch. He's the main line from which all the rest of these families are going to come. He has a son named Isaac, and Isaac has two sons, Esau and Jacob. Now, the reason Abraham's significant is because God gives Abraham a promise. From you, all of the families of the earth will be blessed. In other words, Abraham's given the messianic promise that one of Abraham's children, way down the line, is going to be the one that saves and redeems humankind, okay? And so they're looking forward to that promise. Abraham only has one son, Isaac. Isaac has two sons, Esau and Jacob. As we know, Jacob steals the blessing of Esau because Esau was the younger of the twin brothers. Jacob is the younger of the twin brothers. And so because of that, Esau is furious with Jacob because he has taken his blessing. And so he wants to kill him. Okay, and so as soon as Isaac, his father, dies, Esau's plan is to go and murder Jacob because he is so angry. And so what ends up happening is Jacob flees and goes to a place called Padan Aram, which is actually 500 miles away. So I have a map. I don't know how clear it is, but basically he's in this area, this lower area, and he's going all the way to this top area, okay? Now that distance is actually, I calculated, about 500 miles away. 500 miles away is the distance from here to the Grand Canyon. Okay, so he makes this journey to go see his mom's brother, so basically his uncle. And so he travels these 500 miles to go and stay with his uncle's house, which is 500 miles away from Esau, so that Esau can't kill him. And on the way, Jacob falls asleep in this one place, and God comes to him in a vision. And basically, God communicates to Jacob that God cares for him and that God is with him. And if you have been with us the last couple weeks, you know that we emphasize this particular verse a lot because it's so meaningful to Jacob. And again, I really have been emphasizing that this should be meaningful to us as well. So God says to Jacob, "Behold, I am with you and will keep you wherever you go and will bring you back to this land. For I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you." And so this is what God communicates to Jacob, that he is there for him, that he is going to be with him, and he's going to fulfill everything that he's promised to his fathers and to himself. And so this is God telling Jacob, "I'm with you wherever you go." And then Jacob goes to Padan Aram. He falls in love and marries his uncle's daughter, Rachel, right? And the uncle's name is Laban. And so he marries Rachel, which is Laban's younger daughter. But Laban is a schemer, and he also tricks Jacob, just in the same way that Jacob tricked his father to steal Esau's blessing. Laban tricks Jacob into marrying his oldest daughter, Leah, the wives, right? So now he has two wives. He intended on only having one, but he has two wives. They have a battle over their husband. And so from Genesis 29 all the way until Genesis 30, there's this whole entire story about sort of how the family grows and how there's this sort of scandalous battle between the two wives. And so by the time you get to Genesis 31, Jacob has essentially two wives, okay? Two servants that he's slept with and has children with, okay? So they're not technically wives, but they potentially, you might as well call them wives. And he has 11 children, okay? And so by the time we actually get to Genesis chapter 31, he's actually been with Laban for 20 years. So we're crossing a lot of time in a very short period of time in terms of what we're studying. And there's a ton more detail, and it's totally worth reading, and I think that you should go back and read it if you haven't. But in the midst of all of that, okay, God is incredibly gracious to Jacob. So in the midst of the drama that's going on with the family, the drama that's going on at work in regards to Jacob's work with Laban, God is gracious to him. And through that time, there's this incredible transformation. And Jacob actually begins to trust in God. And here's the thing, okay? Here's the thing. This is probably the most important thing that I want you to get from this entire series as we study the life of Jacob is how does Jacob become this person who trusts in God? What is it that Jacob sees and experiences that causes him to trust in God? And the idea is that he's noticing God's grace and he's noticing God's kindness. And that's what this series has been really about. It's about pointing you in the direction of showing you how good and how gracious God is. Because if you see that, then you can learn to actually trust in him. And then trusting in him is where you get transformation in your life. And so I want you guys to just close your eyes for a second, okay? Because again, silence is helpful to process this stuff. And it's so important that we get an opportunity to do this because, again, I think what we're able to do on a Sunday is so little in terms of time, and I just wish we had more time. And so exercises like this are actually really, really, really important. So just take a moment, close your eyes, and just honestly, okay, answer this question in your head. Like, do you believe that God is for you? Do you believe that God is for you? Do you believe that God is gracious? And do you believe that God is good? And just really think about that question. Okay, open your eyes. The reason why I'm having you guys do that is because that's the question. That's the question. In order to have a relationship with God, you have to believe in that first. So how do we get there? Well, the story of Jacob continues to push us in this idea of, okay, Jacob's not a great person when we first meet him, right? He steals Esau's blessing, he schemes, he does all of this stuff. And as the story progresses, okay, we become more sympathetic to Jacob as he moves along, and he matures. But the idea is that he grows in his relationship with God through God being gracious to him. And so the idea is, how do we begin to know what that's like, and how do we begin to experience that for ourselves? And so what ends up happening is Jacob, his family continues to grow. He serves under Laban for 20 years, and Laban is so overbearing that Jacob decides, this is it, I have to leave. I have to go back. Right? I've been apart from my family for 20 years. I need to journey back to them, and I need to settle back there. And what ends up happening is God tells Jacob, hey, now is the time. Why don't you go, take your family and leave, and I'll be with you. And so that's what Jacob does. Laban, of course, doesn't want him to leave, so Jacob actually steals away in the night. So he sneaks away at night, in the middle of the night. Jacob takes all his flock, all of his wealth and possessions and all that, and he just gets up in the middle of the night and takes off. He has a couple days head start. Laban figures out which direction he went in, and so goes after him. And so Laban goes after him, and there's this really interesting thing that happens in chapter 31 where Laban is coming after Jacob. They have this confrontation. They have this clash. And essentially, God comes to Laban in a dream and basically says, don't you dare touch Jacob. Don't you dare do anything to him. And so Laban, afraid of that, actually confronts Jacob, but then doesn't kill him, doesn't, do anything. They just have this truce, okay, this treaty that's sort of made. And the reason why that's significant is because this is where God's promise goes into sort of hyperdrive, and it really starts. Because again, Abraham to Isaac, that's one generation, that's one son. Isaac to Esau and Jacob, that's again 2 generations, 2 sons. And then from Jacob to his family, right, you have, again, 2 wives, 2 servants, and 11 children. And so the idea is, from one generation to another, you have this massive expansion. And the idea is God's promise is now being true. But again, they were under Laban's household. So technically, they were under the family of Laban. And so this treaty is important because what ends up happening is, in Genesis chapter 31, God takes Jacob's family and makes them his own family, makes them his own tribe. Okay? So the idea is the promise of God to make from Abraham a nation is actually starting to really have some traction in Genesis 31. In other words, what God promises to Abraham, decades earlier, you actually start to see it kind of taking place. And there's this interesting detail about how they set up this treaty. But essentially, Laban is saying, you are no longer my family. You are your own family. You go. Right? And it's on the tail end of that we actually get to chapter 32. Now, I'm going to go ahead and skip all this This is detail that's good. Okay, Gilead is where the treaty takes place, right? And if you zoom into the map, you'll see that there's going to be a particular area that we're going to zoom in on, which is right here, okay? And that's where chapter 32 takes place. So if you go to Genesis chapter 32, in verse 1, it says this: Jacob went on his way, and the angels of God met him. And when Jacob saw them, he said, "This is God's camp." So he called the name of that place Mahanaim. And Jacob sent messengers before him to Esau his brother in the land of Seir, the country of Edom, instructing them, "Thus you shall say to my lord Esau, thus says your servant Jacob, I have sojourned with Laban and stayed until now. I have oxen, donkeys, flocks, male servants and female servants. I have sent to tell my lord in order that I may find favor in your sight." And the messengers returned to Jacob, saying, "We came to your brother Esau, and he is coming to meet you, and there are 400 men with him." So what's really interesting is Jacob now is coming back to the land that his family is from, because now they're this own family, they're this own tribe, and they're kind of coming back home. And one of the things Jacob knows is that what's waiting for him in this country, in this place that he used to call home, but for 20 years hasn't, as he's coming back, he's recognizing that he has to make amends with his brother. The reason why he left was because he had this conflict with Esau. He stole Esau's blessing. And so now he's coming back, and what he wants to do is he wants to make sure Esau knows, look, I'm coming back, I've been gone a long time, but now I have all of this stuff, and I'm totally willing to serve you with it. In other words, Esau, if you're still mad, please don't be. Look at how much wealth I have. Here, you can have it all. Right? And so the men go down, they actually meet with Esau, right? So Jacob sends messengers, and those messengers go and meet Esau. And this is what they said. They come back, and they don't say whether or not Esau's mad, happy. They just say this, verse 6 again. "We came to your brother Esau, and he is coming to meet you, and there are 400 men with him." Now imagine if you were Jacob, what would you feel? What would you be thinking, right? Look at verse 7. "Then Jacob was greatly afraid and distressed, because 400 men is the size of an army." In other words, Jacob sends the messengers ahead with this message like, "I'm coming, but I have all this stuff. Here's a gift for you." And what he gets word back is, "Oh, Esau's coming, and Esau's coming with 400 men." In other words, Esau and his men have formed an army, and they're coming up to meet you. And so now Jacob's heart is crushed, right? He is greatly afraid and distressed. He is anxious. He's in a place where he doesn't know what to do. Now, there's a detail that you probably missed because I skipped over it. And go back to verse 1. This is really crucial. It says in verse 1, "Jacob went on his way, and the angels of God met him. And when Jacob saw them, he said, 'This is God's camp,' so he called it." In other words, the moment Jacob steps back into his homeland, God sends him a physical sign. Right? "Remember, Jacob, I'm with you. Oh, you forgot? Here, let me reassure you that I'm really there for you." And so he sends a camp of angels. And the angels of God sit with Jacob, and God says, "Woo, God is with me." But as soon as Jacob hears about Esau coming with his men, what does Jacob do? He's afraid and he's distressed. There's a similar story in the New Testament. The apostles are on a boat. There's this massive storm. Jesus walks across the water, and the disciples are freaked out. They're like, "Oh my gosh, it's a ghost." And Jesus says, "It's not a ghost, it's me. It's Jesus." And Peter was like, "Well, if it's really you, then tell me to come out onto the water with you." Jesus says, "Yeah, it's me, so come on out." And so Peter gets out, and Peter actually walks on water too, and I think we forget that. Jesus is not the only man who ever walked on water. Peter walked on water for a few seconds, until what? He looked over and saw the storm and then started to sink, right? In other words, you and I are doing what Jacob does, are doing what Peter does all the time. Where you come to church on a Sunday and you read and you look at the Bible and you're like, okay, I think God is with me, and then Monday through Saturday, we just forget. We're so good at forgetting that God is with us. We're so good at forgetting that God has promised to be with us. And we have this idea because what happens is Monday through Saturday, so much of our fear and our anxiety communicates to us satanic truth that God is not for us. God is not that good. God is whatever. And so what ends up happening is that beats us down. And so oftentimes on Sunday morning when I see you guys, you're beaten down, right? A lot of you don't want to be here. A lot of you would rather stick in headphones and just listen to music and just drown out your sorrows, your anxieties, your fears, your discomforts. I mean, just a whole host of bad, negative things. And it breaks my heart because that's not what's actually true of who God is. God actually is there for us. It's just we're so focused on looking at everything else and not looking at God that we forget. Because again, when Peter takes his eyes off of Jesus, he begins to drown. When Jacob takes his eyes off of the angels, he begins to get worried and distressed. And again, this is Jacob's character, right? I mean, this entire time that we've been studying Jacob's life, he doesn't really do much with God in mind. He has a tendency to take things into his own hands because he's a guy of control, just like we are. He wants to take things into his own hands. When it came to getting the blessing, Jacob took it into his own hands. When it came to getting the wife that he wanted, he took it into his own hands. He got screwed over in every single instance, right? And it doesn't really seem to be learning. But yet again, that's what he does. Because again, that's who he is. That's his impulse. That's my impulse, right? More often than not, rather than relying on God, I would rather rely on my own ability to do something because of my sinful tendency to want control. And the truth is, that's what causes us to have this doubt and this gap of like, I know God is supposed to be there for me, but I don't feel it. There's this gap. Right? And a lot of us, we just kind of live in that empty space in between. I know in my head God is there for me. I've been taught that ever since I was in kindergarten. God loves me. God is there for me. And yet what I actually believe and what I actually feel and how I live my life, there's this gap. Because it's like, I don't actually believe that Monday through Saturday. And so what does Jacob do? Verse 7. Jacob was greatly afraid and distressed. He divided the people who were with him and the flocks and herds and camels into two camps, thinking if Esau comes to one camp and attacks it, then the camp that is left will escape. In other words, he's now like coming up with plan B. Okay, plan B. If he attacks this one, at least half of my family will be able to get away. Verse 9, and Jacob said, O God of my father Abraham and God of my father Isaac, O Lord who said to me, return to your country and to your kindred that I may do you good. I am not worthy of the least of all the deeds of steadfast love and all the faithfulness that you have shown to your servant, for with only my staff I crossed this Jordan, and now I have become two camps. Please deliver me from the hand of my brother, from the hand of Esau, for I fear him, that he may come and attack me, the mothers with the children. But you said, I will surely do you good and make your offspring as the sand of the sea, which cannot be numbered for multitude. And so now Jacob is desperate, right? So again, takes matters into his own hands first, and then comes to God, because again, he has no other plans. And so he comes to God, and he actually gives this really incredible prayer of brokenness and of desperation. And if you look at Jacob, chapter 31 and 32 is really the first time Jacob is really acknowledging God in his life. And notice, what does Jacob do when he finally gets all of that control stuff out of the way and he's by himself? He gets down on his knees and he prays, and notice what he prays. He acknowledges that it's God that's been leading him this entire time. He acknowledges that it's God that's been faithful to him. He acknowledges that God is the one that's been doing all of this, and God's the one that led him here. And so now he's asking God, remember your promise. Remember that you said that you were going to do this for me. Verse 13. So he stayed there that night, and from what he had with him, he took a present for his brother Esau, 200 female goats and 20 male goats, 200 ewes and 20 rams, 30 milking camels and their calves, 40 cows and 10 bulls, 20 female donkeys and 10 male donkeys, and a partridge in a pear tree. Okay, verse 16. These he handed over to his servants, every drove by itself, and said to his servants, pass on ahead of me and put a space between drove and drove. He instructed the first, when Esau, my brother, meets you and asks, to whom do you belong? Where are you going? And whose are these ahead of you? Then they shall say, they belong to your servant Jacob. They are a present sent to my lord Esau, and moreover, he is behind us. He likewise instructed the second and the third, and all who follow the droves. You shall say the same thing to Esau when you find him, and you shall say, moreover, your servant Jacob is behind us. For he thought, I may appease him with the present that goes ahead of me, and afterward I shall see his face. Perhaps he will accept me. So the present passed on ahead of him, and he himself stayed that night in the camp. So what does Jacob do? He takes the camp that's remaining, sent one camp ahead, takes the one camp that's remaining, splits them up into groupings of animals as presents, takes the servants and says, all right, you with the rams, you guys go first. Go a couple hours ahead, and then the lambs, you guys go next, and then the 30 milking cows, and then the partridge in a pear tree, and the turtle doves, and everybody else right behind. You guys go one thing at a time, couple hours apart. So when Esau sees the first group coming, Esau's going to be like, hey, who are you with? What are you doing? Whatever. And then you can say, oh, this is a gift from your younger brother, Jacob, who loves you very much and is super sorry and is so happy to meet you and hopes that you're not angry with him. Thank you. Here you go. You're welcome, right? And then a couple hours later, as Esau's traveling with his 400 men, his army, there would be a group of sheep, right? And the messenger would say the same thing. This is like, Esau would ask, who is this and what are you doing? And again, the servants would say, blah, blah, blah. This is from Jacob and he's really sorry and he's so happy to meet you and we hope you're not mad at him and here's the sheep. And on and on and on. And so wave after wave after wave of offering to Esau, please don't be mad. As you come nearer to Jacob, please be happier and happier and happier, okay? And again, some of you guys know this tactic, right? You've gone to a fight with your parents and you know you did something bad, and so you get into house after school and you're like cleaning your room when you don't normally clean your room, right? You're like doing your homework and you're like doing it not in your room but in your living room so your parents can see, like, I know you're mad, but I'm doing my work. Look, math book open, right? Look, headphones are over here, right? Or like your dad's mad at you, he comes back from work, you're like, hi, Dad, like when you normally could care less whether or not your dad comes from work, right? So Jacob's doing all this, and he's kind of like, I hope you're okay. And then it says in verse 22, the same night he arose and took his 2 wives, his 2 female servants, and his 11 children and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. He took them and sent them across the stream and everything else that he had. And so in the last thing he does, just in case Esau really is out to kill him, he sends his family on ahead. And he spends some time alone. And it says in verse 24, and Jacob was left alone. And a man wrestled with him until the breaking of the day. When the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he touched his hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. Then he said, let me go, for the day has broken. But Jacob said, I will not let you go unless you bless me. And he said to him, what is your name? And he said, Jacob. This is so weird. Okay? Just get that out of the way. This is so unusual. It's so unusual, and there's no part of this that's normal. In other words, there's no part of this where because again, Moses wrote this, and he wrote this for ancient Israelites, so the ancient Near East culture, right, isn't normal for you to be camping alone by yourself, and then a stranger comes and wrestles with you. The idea is no, there is no culture, no time where this is regular behavior for men, okay? It never in the history of human beings has this ever been normal behavior. This is meant to be like, what the heck is going on, right? This is meant to be read out loud, and in the middle of the story, children raise their hand and ask the rabbi, what is happening? Like, are you sure you didn't mix up some scrolls? Like, what is going on? And it's meant to be that way because what's interesting is it says that a man came to wrestle with Jacob. So this is not this is not like some spirit. This is a man, a physical man. So Jacob says goodbye to his wives and kids, kisses them and says, I hope I'll see you again. Daddy's really stressed. Pray for me, but you guys need to go for your safety. And the wives are like, come on, children, let's go. And as moms, they grab all the kids, they go across, they cross the river. He's sitting there on the other side, and he's just like, what do I do? And then a man taps him on the side. He turns around. They just start and they start wrestling. It's so weird. Okay, just let's get that out of the way. It's meant to be weird, okay? And in fact, if you guys know the history of this, you know that this is the reason why Jacob changes his name into Israel. In other words, this is the moment, and the chapter before this is the moment where Israel's history is born. And the question is, okay, most of us in this room are Korean. So it's how did Korea get started, right? And you could talk about the myths of there was a tiger god, and you could start there, okay? Or you could go to actual history. There were the Mongols, and you could do that, okay? But imagine if your history starts there's this dude, he was super anxious and worried, and then a man came and wrestled him, gave him a new name, and that's how Israel, you're like, what? It doesn't make any sense, and it's not meant to. It's meant for you to just kind of take a step back and be like, what the heck is going on? Because you guys read this in your small group, right? Verse 28. Then he said, your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed. And so now the jig is up, right? Jacob didn't just wrestle with another man. He wrestled with God. And it's so strange. This story is so strange. Because what is God doing coming down and wrestling with Jacob? Now, keep in mind that when Jacob first had an encounter with God, God came to him and gave him a vision of this ladder that reaches from earth to heaven. And he saw on this ladder angels descending and ascending, meaning angels were going back and forth between earth and heaven. That's what he saw. And then he saw this figure at the top, and this figure at the top basically said, I'm with you, like revealed that he's God. And the idea is, okay, that's strange too. Like, why would God show him that? And the idea is, the interpretation of the dream is pretty simple, actually. It's this. God is showing Jacob that God is doing a number of things, like millions of things on a daily basis that Jacob is unaware of. In fact, and that's true for us, God is doing at any given moment in our life a million different things. There are tens of thousands of things happening in every single moment of your life and of my life that God is doing in the spiritual realm that we are completely unaware of. We have no clue that all of this is happening. And then, in this instance, rather than coming to him in a vision, God actually takes the form of a man and physically wrestles with Jacob. Now, again, they wrestle not for 5 minutes, not for 10 minutes, not for an hour. They wrestle from the moment it's dark until the moment the light is breaking. That's at least 8 hours, okay? Some of you have played basketball for 30 minutes and you're exhausted. Imagining wrestling with somebody for 8 hours. And you know Jacob is strong. You know Jacob is strong because when he first wanted to meet Rachel, remember there was a well and there was a stone in front of the well and it took many men to move that stone and Jacob did it all by himself. So this wrestling match was intense probably the entire night. And at one point, right, the man just touches Jacob's hip and his hip pops out of his socket. And again, just so weird, like why that? Well, it's because, again, this man is showing Jacob like, yeah, you're kind of winning, but at the same time, I could touch you and you can lose, right? But look, it says in verse 26, then he said, let me go for the day has broken. In other words, this man has shown Jacob how powerful he is, that he's not just some average human being. And again, Jacob is aware of angels that are around him because that's what it says at the top of chapter 32. So Jacob's wrestling. He's wrestling with everything he has. His hip is displaced, but he doesn't let go. He like clings to this man. So much so that this man says, okay, let me go. For the day has broken. Like, dude, there's a light. It's over, right? But notice what Jacob says in verse 26. I will not let you go unless you bless me. Now, question, why does Jacob react this way? Because Jacob is so stressed, and he's so distressed, and he's so anxious, and he's filled with worry. In other words, he's in a place where he knows that unless the person that he is wrestling with, who he knows is not just an average man, but some sort of supernatural being, Jacob probably has an idea that this is God, right? By this point, and he'll say this later too. Right? He says in verse 30, he called the name of this place Peniel, saying, for I have seen God face to face, and yet my life has been delivered. Right? So he knows this is God. In other words, Jacob knows that without God helping him, like he can't survive the night. And so he just clings to God with everything he has. And notice this man says, what is your name? And okay, like, wait, does God not know who Jacob is? Why would he be asking for Jacob's name? And it's because in this particular instance, remember, Jacob in the night, in Isaac's blindness, his father's blindness, when Isaac said, what is your name? What does Jacob say? Esau, right? And then in the night, when Jacob thinks that he's, having the first night of his marriage with Rachel, okay? In other words, there's this idea of like the name, okay, being really important, and in the middle of the night asking for the name, like there's a theme there. And I want you to see here that when God asks Jacob his name, he's basically saying, I want you to tell me who you are. And what does the name Jacob mean? It means deceiver. Admit that you're a cheater. Admit that you're a deceiver. Confess your weakness and your loneliness. And as soon as he'd done that, right, verse 28, then he said, your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel. And that's key. is to recognize that God pulls at that weakness, not to make Jacob feel really bad about himself, but to replace that identity with a brand new one. And what's really interesting is Hosea 12:4 actually says about this situation. Verse 4, he strove with the angel and prevailed. He wept and sought his favor. He met God at Bethel, and there God spoke with us. He wept and sought his favor. Jacob was desperate for God to move in his life. And it's from that desperation, it's from that weakness that God comes to him and gives him a new identity and gives him a new name. You and I, everything we do that when we're operating out of our own strength, okay, it will continue to be my thing and my life. But the moment that we can begin to let all of that go and begin to give that to God is when our identity begins to transform and we begin to acknowledge that, wait, God is for me and I operate out of his strength and I operate out of his grace. And we're going to close with this, okay? Because what's really interesting is at the end, Jacob basically says, like, I met God face to face and I escaped that situation. And in other words, God came to me and granted me his mercy. And the reason why there was this wrestling match and the reason why there was this struggle is so that Jacob would know that God is with him. It's not just a miraculous occurrence that happened for 5 minutes. Jacob didn't just have a conversation with God for 5 minutes. Jacob physically wrestled with God. That experience would be with him for the rest of his life. That's also why God displaces his hip. Jacob's going to be limping for the rest of his life. And that limp is not a way for Jacob to feel terrible about himself, but that limp is, again, God's way of marking Jacob and letting him know, operate out of your weakness. Don't operate out of your strength. Operate out of your weakness and lean on me and trust in me. So I'm going to ask you guys to close your eyes. Because here's the deal, right? You guys live in an age of anxiety, an age of worry. And yeah, that's bad. It's not good that you guys feel this way and you're so stressed out about everything all the time. It's genuinely not a good thing. But I do wonder if this is how God helps you to see that he's for you and that you actually need him. Rather than trying to self-medicate or self-entertain ourselves out of the negative feelings that we have about our lives, Jesus is actually inviting you guys in to take up his burden and take up his blessing instead. So the question is, what are the things in your life that you worry about? What are the things in your life that stress you out? What are the things in your life that you're unsure about and that cause just insane amounts of anxiety? What are the things in your life that cause depression? What are the things in your life that just make you really bummed out and sad? And that is, when it comes to those things, are you trying to operate with your own might? And are you trying to sort of control your way into making it better? Are you trying to cheat your way through school because academics is worrisome? Are you trying to please your way through your relationship with your parents? Or your brother or your sister, and you just feel like you're walking on eggshells around your family all the time, and just, again, all of that really stresses you out? Or is it that you're just worried in general about where we are in the world, why things are happening the way they are, and you have a lot of questions and a lot of doubts, and you're just not sure what to do with all of that stuff? And I'm inviting you in to not handle that stuff yourself. Admit your weakness. Come before the Lord and give him those things. Pray about those things. Pray the way Jacob prayed. Acknowledging that God is in control. Acknowledging that God is with you. And be open to wrestling with God. And come to him and cling to him and grasp at him. Because ultimately, the story of Jacob is not really about Jacob. Ultimately, it's about Jesus. Because Jesus also would wrestle and grapple with God in the middle of the night. All night long, the night before Jesus was crucified on the cross, he asked God, take this away from me. But he was willing to go through that and then have the ultimate loss on the cross so that you and I could be blessed through his life, death, and resurrection. And so won't you take a moment to take that up, to trust in him, and to lay your burdens before him.